Welcome to Resilience Unplugged, brought to you by Resilience Global Tech African Talent. We're a bold African-rooted cybersecurity podcast covering real stories, practical insights, and emerging voices from across the industry. Hosted by our Resilience team and joined by CISOs, vendors, customers, and partners. I'm Simon Perry, co-founder of Resilience, where we bridge in global innovation with African expertise to tackle today's toughest digital risks. In this episode, I'm especially excited because AI has arrived, but the laws are still lagging behind. Joining me today is Monisha Prem, founder and CEO of MPrem. She's a senior commercial attorney, governance and compliance expert, and experienced board director with more than 20 years across law, business, and finance. Monisha is also a published author and a creator of South Africa's first online legal academy for entrepreneurs. Specializing in governance, risk, and compliance, Monisha is deeply knowledgeable in AI governance, having studied AI governance at IAPP and currently pursuing ISO 42001 certification. With this expertise, she's helping businesses navigate the complex legal and ethical challenges of artificial intelligence. Welcome, Monisha.
Thank you, Simon.
So today we're going to look at how law is struggling to keep up with AI and risks that creates for cybersecurity and what boards and CISOs should be acting on now before new regulations come into play. So Monisha, let's start with your personal journey. When did AI first become a legal concern for you?
From observing trends with my clients, the requests started to move into third-party liability. That was my first biggest concern. In terms of commercial transactions, which is something we specialize in at our law firm, contracting, compliance, facilitating that sort of transaction, we started to see more and more requests around managing third-party liability in terms of usage of artificial intelligence, machine learning, in terms of liability, indemnification, who's going to cover what, ownership, the sources of the content of information that's coming through. And we were asked to draft contracts and policies accordingly. And as the frequency of that increased, it started to pique our interest to see what is the reason for this. This is purely from a commercial and legal perspective. Obviously, on a personal perspective, you started to see this as ChatGPT became used more prominently in the workforce, as well as noticing then when on social platforms, deepfakes, hallucinations, those sort of things started to creep up more and more often.
I guess, some of the points you raised, like if we take a look, how far behind are the laws compared to AI innovation? We're looking at AI tools and new large language models coming up on a daily basis. So, are the laws keeping up with those trends?
So we can look at global tracking to see where the various economies are in terms of the laws. We can also look at the various approaches because not everything is about regulation. Controls can come in other manners. And we can look at where we are in terms of South Africa and within the African continent. So there's a few approaches to this. Global legal regulatory reform. There are some economies that have made some serious advances, such as the EU. The EU has the most comprehensive legislation, and it has now come into force this year in terms of the first portion of it. And this is the EU AI Act. And then we've got about 3 or 4 other, like South Korea, that's in process of releasing legislation. The United States does not have one comprehensive legislation, but has various small legislations that they are rolling out, but are very much pro-innovation. And then you've got, some of like Canada and 1 or 2 other, as I said, global economies that are focused on regulating. The softer approach or the strategic approach seems to be the more common way of dealing with this from various economies. So the Middle East, in terms of the UAE, in terms of Saudi, and various other economies on this end of the world, they are looking at regulating from a guidance perspective. So what you have is you don't have penalties criminalizing of poor conduct and poor players. What you do have is voluntary, such as Singapore has this voluntary hub where you kind of verify your AI tools and your development thereof in a voluntary environment. So, in terms of regulating it, there are different ways of dealing with this beast of AI.
Yeah, I can imagine it's quite complicated, and You and I spoke, I guess, a few weeks ago about this is, it's all great and well to have a regulation, but the innovation's happening so fast. How do we keep up? And I think you touched on, almost building a framework slash checklist in that sense. Do you want to maybe touch on that?
Sure. So far, what has worked actually since 1980 with the OECD fair practice principles for information principles is that it's a risk-based approach. And this is probably the most common and the most practical way of dealing with this. And this is what I would recommend is developing framework with the lack of a single regulation, especially in South Africa, where we are unable to rely on laws because there isn't a single law for AI. We've got to look at self-control, self-regulation in terms of governance and developing frameworks based on international best practices. And the top three practices would be the EU AI Act because it's based on prioritizing different levels of AI machine learning tools that's being released or in the process of being developed and deployed. And in terms of the gold standards, in terms of practical frameworks and operational level, would be the ISO 42001, 27001, the various ISO around that, NIST, which is the US National Intelligence and based framework, also based on mapping, measuring, and deploying a risk-based framework. So this is something that we can adopt within organizations, but I think within our economy, within South Africa itself, this would be an excellent approach to regulating it also from a risk-based, a preventative rather than curative measure.
I guess, touching on risk and looking at, my expertise from a cybersecurity point of view. I mean, we're looking at some of these AI threats, where they're creating deepfakes, I guess AI-driven phishing campaigns, exploit generations. And I mean, it's quite tough to, I guess, be on the defense point of view where you've got these machines now building these type of attacks. I guess, how does the law keep up? And I mean, I know you sort of touched on it's all about legislation and building the frameworks and making sure we stay on top of it. But, interestingly, I looked into, I think it's China, early 2023, they actually created a regulation that took effect where, deep fakes were, I guess, against the law. Is it something that we're looking at in our region? Is it something that you believe that, I guess, Africa will bring that into a legislation point of view?
So from an African perspective, so far, it's a unified approach in terms of all the various states looking at developing strategic cohesion and collaboration about how they're going to approach AI. It has not resulted in regulation just yet, and I'm not aware of anything that is coming anytime soon. However, we've had strategic documentations in terms of the African Union from UNESCO. There's something called, I forget, it just escapes my mind. They are strategic guidelines, and the approach has been very much about protection of civil rights, which is the fundamental issue with the risks in terms of AI, which is the correct approach, considering the nature of the African continent, in terms of protecting humans, people from abuses, which seems to be the common thread in terms of the harms that we are seeing currently, especially against vulnerable humans, children, persons with incapacity mentally or physically, who are relying on external tools and toys and games and conversations. So you heard about the recent chatbot who lured the 76-year-old out of his home, this kind of thing. So the African approach is very much about protecting civil rights. So far, in terms of deepfakes, I think that has and that sort of misinformation, fabrication, misleading, that can seriously harm the African continent. For one, is that we have very poor technical resilience within this country, within the continent. So we already don't have the infrastructure. We do not have the education in place in order to protect our people from misinformation, such as very critical information in terms of law enforcement, in terms of voting at times during, voting times where we are influencing decision making, and also in terms of how we respond to fake information by our people that may not fully understand what deepfake may be and how, or misinformation or bubbles and hallucinations and echo chambers and those kind of threats, what is reality and what isn't. And I think that's a really big challenge. And I think that's something that we need to focus on very quickly. And I think that other than, if I may also add, the challenge now is not just regulating, is enforcement. We're going to have a serious struggle once we bring in regulation within the continent. If our enforcers are not equipped, so I'm talking about judges, prosecutors, training our police, having special AI units, technical teams that understand where the breaches occur. So there's a lot of work to do, and we haven't really started yet. And that's something we need to do quite quickly and quite seriously.
I think there's 2 points that sort of came to mind there. I mean, specifically, you touched on awareness, providing some type of training to, I guess to the people is probably going to be the most important thing. I'm worried, I'm scared, I'm in cyber, I should be able to pick up these type of social engineering attacks, on deepfakes and things like that. But if you're getting a phone call from a good friend or a family member and you believe it's somebody who's in trouble, I guess 90% of the time you probably are going to provide some information or pay some money to a syndicate. And that's a big concern where, I guess some of the population in our country are not tech savvy, and they can get caught out with these type of scams that we're going to see in the near future. The other point I think you really touched on is, enforcing these type of regulations. And I mean, we look at POPIA, it's been rolled out for a few years now. We haven't seen many type of, I guess, any companies that have been affected from a legal point of view. I don't know if you want to maybe touch on that.
Yes. So in terms of the way South African regulation rolls out, and I think it's beautifully done. We have a wonderful set of laws within our country that we can rely on. First of all, the way, let's say POPIA was rolled out is that it was promulgated, you were given a grace period in order which you would comply. And then after a certain period that you had, it's a penalty, you would receive penalties. It's a punishable act if you're unable to comply with the various protection of personal data. What we have found is that the regulator has been quite good with this. There's been, the last I checked was 700-800 cases that came before the regulator in the last few years. And they've taken a corrective approach, a remediative approach, where they've asked the companies to actually remedy and given them an opportunity to fix, their non-conformities. And that's worked really well. However, there have been some pretty hefty fines. The biggest I've seen was 5 million. And I know that some of our large multinational corporates and our banks, they are seeing quite a strict enforcement of this regulation over the past few years. The biggest controller of the legislation and gives it voice and gives it value is our courts. Once these legislations are being tested in court, and it's part of judgment where you are, then that it's serious and this is how we interpret this particular aspect of the law and how it needs to be applied. That we have seen in the application of social media as and when it was quite reactive, as and when we saw certain trends appearing, in terms of conduct on social media, then we reacted with amending existing legislation to accommodate that. But I think over time, what that does allow for is innovation. It allows for growth. It allows for economic development. It allows for businesses to flourish in using marketing, using branding in terms of operational efficiencies. We can leverage all of this in the interim, and then unfortunately being reactive would, as and when we see these difficulties arising, then we react and put in place measures to control that.
I see that from a public sector point of view, there's some organizations that are now incorporating AI into their processes and workflows. I guess, how are governments balancing, encouraging the AI innovation, but while also trying to protect citizens from harm? Because, I guess day-to-day users might copy sensitive information to a large language model where it could be, POPIA or GDPR information. So, how do we protect that from happening in the future?
So for now, as I said, we've got to do self-regulation, and It starts at board level, at every organization, all the way into operations. And self-control, self-regulation, which is the pillars of governance. And what we need to do is understand where the risks lie and break it down in terms of understanding what is the meaning of transparency with such a complicated system, or, in terms of artificial intelligence, machine learning, when I, as the end user, am entitled to know where the source is, what's going into this program, what's coming out of it. But as a layperson, I do not know what that actually means. So what is the meaning of transparency? What is the real meaning of explainability? How do we break this down within the organization? And how do we respond to that? And how do we implement that? How do we understand that from an end user perspective? It has to be end user friendly. We've got to know what we are dealing with. And we've got to be aware of where the dangers and harm lies within specific tools. Most of the tools will provide us with probably has more benefits than potential losses. So the pros would outweigh the cons, but we can only do this through assessment. We can only do this through awareness. We can only determine what's good for us and what's less harmful, or this is something that has been tested, we have control over it, we're able to implement it and roll it out within our organizations. The control mechanisms around this within organizations would start with a framework, which starts with assessments, studies, analyzing where the risks lie, and then being able to control for that moving forward, and education, training, talking about it, and welcoming it into our organizations.
I think from my point of view, just touching on what you've raised, and like I said, from a cybersecurity point, and some of the conversations I'm having with CISOs, it's all about, do you have an AI risk register? Do you know what your users are using? Do you know, how many tools are out and sitting in, I guess, in your enterprise organization? I mean, we touched on shadow IT a few years ago. There was quite a big growing sort of slogan within our industry. Now it's shadow AI. What tools are being incorporated into the organization? I guess also it comes down to what you touched on, educating the board, providing them, I guess, those key AI use cases. What are we trying to do? How are we trying to build it? I don't think we want to stop the innovation where people are using the tools to, I guess, do better and work faster. But we also need to be careful and ensure that we understand the risks behind it. The other thing from a incident response, I mean, we touched on breaches and things like that. We need to make sure that we keep our incident response plans updated for these type of AI threats. It's quite important to make sure that these response plans are being updated on a regular basis, because as fast as AI innovation's happening, we need to be in a position where, our plans are sticking to those timeframes. I guess if you were advising a board tomorrow, what would be your first step to tell them and how to take it?
So the first approach is to own this, to say we accept that this has arrived. And if we are not using AI, our people are, and our vendors and our customers and clients are using artificial intelligence, machine learning in some manner. So, as you've said, is to determine the status quo, establishing where we are and how we're actually going to respond to this now, and how we're going to prepare for this in the future. And the various frameworks around this would start off with conversation, moving into, as you say, determining where we are, either through risk analysis, preparing registers, understanding who's using what, and then also understanding how this impacts our workforce, our productivity, our efficiencies, and also considering over-reliance on machine versus human, and where we are in terms of our industry requirements. So different industries would require, so creative industries such as marketing agencies would require a larger human in the loop, human centricity than other industries. And you would find that there are limitations at what can and cannot be used that is being imposed by your customers, by your clients. So you've got to be aware of your third-party obligations. So those kind of assessments is more than just understanding, is our staff using ChatGPT? And, are they copying and pasting? It really goes beyond understanding your stakeholders' needs and the risks across the board. And this has to be taken quite seriously. To start off with, also you would need a champion or a team or a subcommittee, depending how big your business is and you need someone to take ownership of this. And as I say, also AI didn't land on the moon because it sounds so distant and so complicated. It actually lands in our business, in our IT team. It lands with legal. It lands with our risk management team. It's part of us now. So how do we deal with this as we are already experiencing and living with it in our environment? So yeah, we actually need a lot more control. So there's a couple of steps that I would start with from a board level. Sorry, Simon, I'm rambling a bit, but at the end of the day, this is an operational challenge. Now, IT permeates, tech permeates, technology permeates the business, but it's very much an operational, on the ground. There has to be a massive marriage and the closure of the gap between boards, governance, and what our people are doing. And that has traditionally, in terms of governance, it's really been a big challenge. Developing big, long, chunky, wordy policies that, even your head of IT says, well, how do I actually implement this? What does this actually mean to me? Those kind of gaps must seriously be closed if you want success in terms of self-regulation, control of AI.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on specifically these large policies that organizations are getting from their boards. It's been quite difficult in our space to like actually, how you mentioned it, is to actually understand it from our point of view. What type of controls, what needs to be put in place. And I think that generally, it comes down to somebody's opinion on what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed. And that's, I guess it becomes a bit of a gray area. And like we touched on earlier, is building out an AI regulation is all great and well, but it needs to be keeping up with the times from an innovation point of view. What's coming out today versus tomorrow might be different. And are the policies, or I guess frameworks, changing to align to that? It's a big worry. I mean, I had an interesting conversation with a customer the last few days, and one of their board members mentioned to me that, he feels that the AI hype will eventually disappear. In my sense, I don't think it will. I mean, I think we're just starting to see the beginnings of what's actually going to happen. I've seen large corporations that are, I guess, getting rid of people because they've got AI bots and tools to actually run the type of jobs that people are running today. In your experience, or maybe if you could touch on, have you sort of dealt with a difficult customer where you actually had to educate them and actually explain it in, I guess, layman's terms?
Well, it's not about difficult customers or clients. What it is about is, at this stage, not accepting the reality of where we are and where this is heading, like you've mentioned, and just even within, not just on multinational and large entities, but mid-sized, smaller companies as well, that, there's a belief that this doesn't really impact us. This is perhaps something that we're not going to be looking at. No one's really using it. And as you say, it may just disappear over time. So, I think governance is always a grudge purchase. Risk management is a grudge purchase. It's until and unless we actually have an event that causes loss, that causes dispute, where we now have to head off to our policies and say, whoa, how do we actually deal with this? How do we respond to this? So I think as business leaders, as business owners, we've got to put on our risk management hat and our strategy development hat. We've got to include various risks as they're presented to us. So, and most business leaders would know that it can take on a different look and feel, whether it is COVID and now dealing with AI. We've got to respond from a risk management perspective. And so, yes, there are people, there are businesses, there are entrepreneurs, there are CEOs that are not really considering the impact of artificial intelligence right now. Perhaps they're in agriculture, perhaps they're in mining. And these are some of our largest industries. And they think, well, it's not going to impact me on the ground, literally here, while I'm mining or machining or farming. But, eventually I think that it does have impact on all of our businesses, and that needs to be accepted sooner rather than later.
Okay, that's very interesting. I guess if you could draft one specific clause into the law tomorrow, what would it be?
So I think the very first would be that we need to, every developer, deployer, user is required to conduct some form of assessment. So an AI impact assessment, an AI register, to actually know what's in your immediate environment. It makes complete sense to me. So I would definitely write in a mandatory assessment of where you are in terms of AI and how you respond to that in terms of prioritizing and ranking them similar to the EU AI Act. What is acceptable, what is permissible, what is harmful, what you would not permit in terms of your risk tolerances, and be able to gauge from that what you can and cannot do. And thereafter, create a response program or response framework to that. That should be mandatory across all organizations, that there is an awareness, there is a response, and then they are documenting this within their organization. So that's definitely something I can do. And I would also request, I would write in about the responsibilities from board to operations and how, such as yourself, technical engineers, IT professionals are working with leaders in terms of closing that gap to make those policies and the steps meaningful, so that we don't use large words like integrity without really understanding what that means to data. What does that mean to me in terms of dealing with a particular relationship that is managing our data? So there has to be that connection.
Collaboration. I think
Yes.
that it's so important. I mean, if we work together and, I guess we both understand each other's roles, I think we could easily sort of implement and deploy something into an organization to, I guess, mature that customer from an AI point of view.
Yes.
And then, Monisha, I guess in one sentence, what would be your message to CISOs? I guess in Africa, maybe in different regions, how would you approach a CISO with one sentence from an AI point of view?
So let's see, one sentence. You're asking me to be succinct. With the lack of regulation and legislation, and knowing that the big businesses such as X and Meta and the top 5 worldwide, we know based on surveys that they are seriously lagging in terms of managing risks. We see this. It has been measured, and we understand that they are innovating faster than they are controlling the harm to community, to economies, and to individuals. Therefore, it is the responsibility of CISOs to ensure that they are protecting their organization and their environments. It is about creating and developing their own protective mechanisms, because there is just not enough to rely on currently. Is that succinct enough?
Monisha, from a fun fact point of view, are there any AI tools that you use on a daily basis that you would probably never get rid of?
Yeah, so I have my ChatGPT as my assistant. I don't work now. I've become over reliant on it. I ask questions, ask for opinions. I collaborate. So that's so that works really, really well for me. And it's a lot more productive. And I feel that for people that work alone, sole entrepreneurs, consultants, get yourself 1 or 2 assistants. You're not alone anymore. So from a fun fact, I just find that I've always worked alone, and I've always relied on, just being able to, to your own opinion and your own discretion, which can be a bit difficult, and that's anti-governance. So if you have a tool, whatever it may be, it actually opens up your world, and you've got a team. And I'm loving, I'm enjoying, really.
I love that. I think I feel the same sentiments to that. I mean, it's so important to I guess incorporate these type of tools into our day-to-day lives. I think I use ChatGPT on a daily basis just because I find it so interesting. I mean, you want more information and you want to summarize an article of some sort. You use that tool to do it, and it's a game changer. I mean, it's helping us save time, and time is the most important thing for us. So I really love that. Yeah, Monisha, I guess thanks for sharing your insights on today. We've seen that AI isn't just a technology issue. It's a governance and legal, challenges. These gaps are widening quite fast. I guess before we end, do you have any closing points you would like to raise or add? I mean, from your point of view?
As I was talking about how I enjoy ChatGPT, I think AI can only be used if you know your trade. You cannot not know your skills and rely on the output of a machine if you don't know yourself to be able to verify. Even though as specialists, we need to still specialize as humans. We need to know our trade, our arts, our craft, and before we ask questions, because I think I find flaws, I find mistakes. And I think we must really be careful. We must verify outputs. And one other point is that the number one risk prevention methodology to AI is human in the loop. To rely on a machine on its own for small, large, major decision making, whether it's in healthcare or finance, I think that you still need human input, either at creation, discovery, development, assessment, delivery, ongoing management. It still requires people. So those are my closing remarks.
Thanks, Monisha. I think you touched on some valid points there. I mean, it comes down to humans. I mean, we all know humans are the biggest risks to these type of threats that we're coming across in our daily lives. But it's all about that awareness, providing the training, educating, our users to make sure that they know what they're doing. I think is probably the most important part. I really appreciate the time that you gave us today. Really sort of some very interesting points that you raised. From my point of view, I just wanted to say, this has been Resilience Unplugged, brought to you by the Resilience Global Tech African Talent. Thanks for listening and stay tuned to our next episodes.